Thank you very much, Alex, and welcome to everybody to this incredible panel. And I'm very, very fortunate and delighted to have the company of four quite incredible people giving us four very different perspectives on the subject of building story worlds. This is not an academic or semantic discussion, so anybody hoping that it would be, you might be disappointed. This is far more practical. And to keep us on track, we have a designer, producer, an advisor, and a creator of content. And I am going to waste no more time because there's a heck of a lot to get through, and each of these people could speak for a good few hours on their own. And I'm going to ask each to introduce themselves, and I'll start with Alex.
Hi, good day. I don't know what time of day it is. Actually, I'm in LA, but I'm Alex McDowell. I have been a production designer for 30 years. I kind of stopped doing production design when I started teaching at USC. So I teach world building there since 2012, and I'm a creative director at a studio, essentially a world building studio called Experimental. And well, that's who I am.
Thank you. Diana.
Hi. I've been producing across all
I think we've got a problem with the audio with you, Diana. I will come back. We'll come back to you in a second. Clifford.
Hello, everyone, in whatever time zone you're in. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm Clifford Johnson, so I'm a professor of physics at the University of Southern California. Most of the time I do physics, but I also am very interested in having science be part of everyone's everyday life and everyone's conversation. And so the entertainment industry is of interest to me because it's, of course, where we spend a lot of our time looking. And so I often help people with designing content, including science and science concepts and scienciness into their work, whether it be in the arts or entertainment.
Brilliant. And Vivian.
Hello. Yes, I am Vivian Medrano, and I have created a number of original stories and concepts and IPs, and I am the creator and development head of a project called Has Been Hotel and another project called Hell of a Boss and a few others. So yeah, I'm just a indie animation director, I guess is what I do.
Thank you. Well, look, we'll get straight into it, and what I'm going to do is come back to Alex because it feels only right to start with the person whose work is almost wholly world building, and that entirely rather than religiously holy. So, Alex, you're obviously very visually motivated. You're a designer. I know you've got a video to show us that introduces the work that you do. But perhaps you might just want to sort of introduce that and just explain a little bit about sort of why is world building so important to you? What role does it play other than generating an income?
Yeah, this is the religious sense, actually, in the sense of world building. The world building is, what I discovered is that actually I've been world building for 30 years. What I'm now realizing and have for the last 20 years is that it's a foundation, that world building actually reflects the way the world works. That in story terms, there was this progression where storytelling, I believe, essentially allowed us to survive as a human race because it passed knowledge down from generation to generation. It gathered knowledge. Storytellers gathered around that knowledge, created metaphor, and this is where we are now, and always have been in entertainment media. But we've turned, in the last 600 years, we've gone into a linear narrative space, which fundamentally undermines the idea of oral tradition and storytelling as a collective. So our view, my substantial kind of driver is that we are back in the situation of needing to make sense of the world around us. Most of the people we work with are unable to rely on what they knew 10 years ago, 20 years ago, last year, as we discover right now. And so worldbuilding is a platform which is designed to absorb knowledge and transmit knowledge on multiple platforms. So we're platform and media agnostic, and to transmit that knowledge with multiple viewpoints. So we, my underlying ethos is that that these stories always exist in parallel. We walk outside the door, and all of those stories are going on at the same time. And we've been trained to kind of select them and to do this kind of this lens, essentially authorial, single author. This is what I want you to look at now. And it's placed the audience in the audience space behind the proscenium or in front of the proscenium and the author on the stage. And that isn't a realistic way to engage narrative. And so I use the analogy of jazz, and just to say classical music into jazz is the kind of translation we want to try and make.
Great. Is it? Shall we play the video? Because I think it does an amazing
please.
job.
There's some examples.
The breadth of work that you work on. Look at the video. We'll sit patiently and hope that the video is. Alex, while we're waiting, the video might kick in at any point, in which case that's fine if we just suddenly get cut off. But while we wait for that, can you just the process that you go through in creating sort of story worlds? You don't start with anything really other than sort of questions. Is that right? You don't, like, typically, like with Minority Report, which is sort of the prototype, like you don't start with a script or a piece of IP. You just start with questions and work from there. Like, how the heck does that work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we start with a kind of container of intent. We have a specific larger question, whether it's a film with specific sets of narratives that are in play, or a scientist who's asking how one translates molecular biology into a language that can be understood by the lay audience. So we start off with that. This is the specific and unique world that we're dealing with. But I'm always the most ignorant person in the room. I know nothing about the people asking me those questions are specialists in the field. They just don't know how to create a language to transmit their field very often. So the questions we ask are knowledge gathering. We know that we are not the experts. And so the first notion of collaboration is create the answers to those questions by asking the right people, or provoking different people to consider questions they haven't been asked before. And so those questions actually are provocations to draw knowledge. And we use a methodology of this idea, which you've seen, Iain, is the mandala, the notion of a holistic world that is asking a specific set of questions that, if they're not answered, that holistic container of narrative is faulty, is flawed. But it's a fluid system. You can absorb knowledge over years if you need to. And it just gets richer and richer. And we start with context. And so, again, sort of a logic of where are we, when are we, what are the specific definitions of this world as opposed to any other. And then we move through scale. We go, well, a city exists in the world, let's say, as a metaphor. A district or a zone exists inside a city. A street corner exists inside the zone. The street corner is essential because it's a microcosm of a world. And so we spend a lot of time working out how to build that city by engaging a group around a street corner, because the city is essentially an unmanageably large space. But we can apply that two enormous spaces. If we go back down to the center, and then the center is the human that we're asking. In a way, once we get down there, the story starts. The context is the world. Now you can send those stories back out into the world, and then the stories test the world, and it's a fluid, circular development. So I'm sorry, I'm confused. Are we going back to the
That's it.
questions
Yeah,
asked before?
we're all back. We're all back now. Alex, that's an amazing sizzle reel of all the work that you do. And obviously it goes way beyond entertainment content. You apply that world building technique to a whole range of purposes. Just how, like, what precisely is, like, what's the start? How do you start? Like, what is the starting question, and how do you decide what that starting question is?
I think what we try and do is find an essential provocation, something that is going to kickstart it. With Minority Report and the sequence of the cars, we asked, how did Tom Cruise get to work in the morning? It's kind of just like really basic stuff that by starting to answer that question, you actually drill down into the world from top to bottom. And so that's often the starting point. As I say, the questions are really important. The questions are defined by what if and why not. A lot of this is future facing. It's future facing because it liberates people from the present. Their imagination kicks in, but the base of that is applicable to anything. And this is a discovery making more and more. We're being asked to do work with education space, with indigenous tribes, with the molecular biologists. So the pancreatic beta cell is an example of the starting point of that was scientists don't know how to tell stories. Sorry, because this doesn't apply to Clifford, but there are translation issues, that you have this extremely esoteric language for molecular biology, which is incomprehensible, frankly, to anybody except for molecular biologists. But how they collaborate has been the issue, and so we had to form a visual language, which was a core language that was applicable and understandable from high school students to nuclear physicists. And so that's breaking down something that needed to be absolutely authentic in science. It has to be absolutely accurate in scientific terms, and it has to be absolutely capable in architectural terms. So it's this arc between biology and architecture. That in itself has been the purest version of world building, because it's been an integration of art and science to the extent you can't tell them apart. In the city-based project, we're being asked to develop 5 cities 50 years in the future to give an education base for the civil engineers, American Society of Civil Engineers. It's a massive story world. And those 5 cities are designed for engineers to consider deeply a future that is not part of their lens, or has not been. This goes back to the world doesn't work the same way as it used to. And so how do you provoke them? In this case, we call it a provocation machine. The entire system is dense with knowledge. It's interactive. The scientists, the engineers go in and they are challenged, and they're challenged with a world that's 50 years ahead, 25 years ahead. It comes from all of the research we do, the provocations. They're able to push back their knowledge, and this circular system creates essentially the core, the essence of what a city is, from the levels of mobility to architecture. It's embedded in narrative. Every single thing we do is based in story, but it's powerfully applied to, it's still, to my mind, the most powerful tool we have, but it's not an entertainment media tool per se. It's extremely effective, and it should be substantially world first in entertainment media from top to bottom, but it applies equally to almost anything, is what we've discovered at multiple scales. Right. In summary, that's.
Alex, I mean, essentially the work that you do, like, it just creates sort of like the vast opportunities, right? Like, I'm going to bring Diana in here because, like you, Diana's worked on a whole range of established IP and developing new sort of IP and applied sort of world building techniques to that. But this world building that you're involved with, and Alex has described, like, you can create sort of vast numbers of new storylines, new characters, but inevitably, like, it costs money. I mean, all of that, look, it looks beautiful, but is expensive. And Diana, I think as a producer, I don't think it'd be unfair for me to say you wouldn't be spending time world building if it didn't ultimately help you connect with an audience in some way. Would that be fair comment?
Yeah. Not only the help of the audience, it's the backbone of everything. So the way that I do stories are contract. The contract is.
We're having a little trouble with the audio, I think, there.
Okay, I thought they fixed it.
That's much clearer. There we go.
That's clear? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, got it. So, so the story, so story is a contract between storyteller and fan. And so the way I look at world building, it's like you're just thinking about the skeleton of what can become the story. As Alex was saying, is like he looks at the street corner as a microcosm of the world. And I always talk about streets. Who's walking on the street, why they're walking on it, how they're walking on it. And so by building that core and by building those rules, you're establishing for the fan, for the audience, how you hope that they're going to live in that world, whether it's playing in that world, whether it's running a campaign for the world, whether it's a book series, whatever it is, you're asking them to live in that world. And that contract gets broken when a storyteller breaks their own rules. And so that's why I do think that world building is so important, because you are establishing for yourself the truth and authenticity of your world. And then the fan and the audience comes to that for those reasons. So it's a really important part of the process that I think I hope to see more and more filmmakers attempt it.
Brilliant. And you obviously you apply those techniques to you. Obviously, you're looking for franchises as part of your role, but you also, as we discussed, you've applied that to singles as well. And to sort of regardless, could you just talk about how you use world building and building of story worlds to spot the potential of new creative properties, like for new IP rather than working with established IP?
Yeah. So like the way that I think about franchise is just it's a container. It's a way for people to continue to enjoy something that they love. It is an ability for that when the film is not in theater or when the TV show is not up, to continue to walk in the shoes of those characters that we love, that we want to kind of enjoy, we want to understand their journey. That's, to me, all that a franchise does. And so when I'm looking at any properties or any projects or filmmakers and creators that I'm working with, it's just how deep and what's the breadth and width of the world that they want to create. And so I use that as my litmus test. And it's also, as you know, again, what I love that Alex said was about the faulty container. So if someone can't answer these questions, it's going to all fall apart. So it's an important mechanism. So when I look at these things that I'm working on now, for instance, with Voyage to the Stars, that was created by Ryan Koppel. That is a new franchise. It was an idea that he had that we thought was phenomenal and fun and adventurous and with great characters. And so what we first did with that was launched it as a podcast. And it was a way to world build via audio and via our verbiage, as opposed to, we weren't locked into a visual yet. And by doing podcasts, we were able to, we don't have to worry about the laws of physics. We don't have to worry about material coming in. We don't have to worry about my gosh, the grip truck didn't show up on time. We were able to just do it and go and be able to work as fast as we wanted to. We then, from there, then people were like, well, what is the visualization? And so we launched with a comic book series just this past fall, which has done very well. We've done it with IDW. And it was, again, another way in which to expand out our story. We added more visuals to things that people were already thinking about in their minds, which is what's great about audio, is that you're listening and you're imagining what these things look like. And then we've been able to then visualize them in the comic book. And so, in which we're now developing it as an animated television series, because what's great is that the fan base is asking for more. We are seeing the creative value, and also just how much we love it too, and that people are also are getting our love for it as well. Then in terms of building the singles into franchises, we're also working with this amazing creator named Jackie Iain on her project called Adorned by Chi. And Jackie herself was a fan. She was already in a community of people who loved anime and manga and cosplay. And her fan base is amazing. She's built it herself. And then we came in to actually help her more on the entertainment side, which we're building out. And so she had already been speaking to her fan base via her socials. She has a very incredible and beautiful Instagram, in which the fans have come to not only love the project, which is Adorned by Chi, which is about 4 Nigerian girls and 1 gentleman, and they get magical powers. It's in the Sailor Moon type of genre. It's a magical girl genre. And she built that relationship with her fans. And so they not only love the project, they also understand her and love her. And they want to know more about her as a creator, but then also the things that she's creating. And so that's how they go hand in hand. And that's what world building can also do. The world building can go, there are pieces of it that can go across different types of platforms and be used in different ways. So that's, so we're, I'm really invested in her, not only as a storyteller, but also as a creative in this industry.
Brilliant. And I love the fact that in doing this, you do work across, like, the media really doesn't matter. You work and apply that world to whatever is going to be the most appropriate media to reach to.
What the media, you still want to tell the proper story for the proper media. So what audio can do, a film can't do. But what a film can do, that group experience, well, when we get back to it, that group experience of the light flickering on your face and story being told to you is a different thing than what a game can do, in a game that you're bodily involved in, you have more agency in. So every time I'm looking at story and I'm thinking about what's the right media platform for the piece of that world that we built, can go to that platform and really fulfill people who love that platform. And so I'm always thinking about people who are on that platform, the story I want to tell, and hopefully find that right.
Brilliant. And you apply this as well to, like, it's not just to fictional properties, but to your factual content as well, in how you're thinking about how to develop up and market the factual IP that you work with.
Yeah, I mean, part of my goal has always been to prove out that you can build franchises and really depth of story world, not only for sci-fi and fantasy, but for other genres as well. And we think about it, especially with horror, we'll think about it from the aspect of like sequels and prequels. But right now I'm working with a chef restaurateur named Win Tran on his memoir, which is called The Adventures of the Starry Kitchen. And he's a chef, and it's a real life experience. But so what we're world building is like his memoir. We're world building the world of food, the world of restaurants, people who love food and love chefs, but also his journey with his wife T as kids of immigrants who are finding the American dream. And so we're going to be launching that first as a podcast. So people can get to know who Win is beyond just what he's done with the restaurant, just how he has used failure to build up, which is across all people. We all think about how we want to restart our lives, and so that's a general theme that we're bringing into the podcast. People get to know him, and then we're also developing it as a television series because the story is so relatable and fun and adventurous. And so again, looking at the different parts of Win's life as a real person, because we think about it. People are a wide spectrum. Individuals have a wide spectrum of experience. And so that's the way I look at world building. And then I also have a project that's my personal project called The Gatecrashers that was created by Zach Mortensen, who I've been a producer with all throughout a lot of my career. And The Gatecrashers started with a simple question of where was medical care going in the future? We were standing on the corner of 7th Avenue and an ambulance went screaming by, and we just started talking about it in building. And I talked about my experiences in China with the ambulances. We talked about Europe. And then we launched with our first comic called Night of Gate Crashing. It's called The Gatecrashers. And then from there, we started, both our backgrounds are in documentaries. So we looked at different documentaries that we'd worked on and different world events, and we built our world using world events. And also, we use a lot of science. And so I'm on the advisory board of the National Academy of Sciences Science and Entertainment Exchange. And that's a way of what we do. We hook up scientists of all types with writers who really want to have science and real world as part of their foundation to the fictional worlds they're building. And so with Gatecrashers, as well as with Space Hoppers, Zach's other project, we worked with scientists to really bring in real science that we then were able to use as our foundation and build our story off of. So that's what it means with world building, so wide ranging in terms of how we apply it to story.
Brilliant. This is almost sounds like a planned segue to Clifford. And I mean, it's like, as you described, like working with advisors, like the value that brings both you and Alex to creating these coherent worlds that feel authentic and real. And Clifford, this is something that's quite fundamental to the role you play as an advisor working with entertainment, and you're coming from outside entertainment, and yet you've been involved in some of the biggest films and TV brands. You've obviously worked a lot with Marvel. You worked on Interstellar, Thor Ragnarok. You've worked on the Agent Carter series. What is the benefit? Can you talk about what's the benefit of working with you? What, as a physicist, are you bringing that's making these incredible directors and brands feel that it's worthwhile, that they want to keep talking to you?
That's a great question. And so first of all, let me just make a small correction. I didn't work on Interstellar. I would have loved to, but I didn't. The thing people usually think of, including people in the industry and including science advisors, on my side, is that somehow it's about ensuring science accuracy. And oftentimes I'm brought in to do an interview, and they're all about this accuracy thing. And I always sort of go, hold on, we're setting everybody up for disappointment here, because it really depends upon what the project is. And so sometimes, yes, I am focused on accuracy, but if I'm helping the Marvel people construct the Marvel universe or some aspect of it, I'm sorry to say, but the science rules there aren't the ones that work in our world. We do not get around by flying with magic hammers and things like that. So, but still, there's a role for me. At least I like to think so. And both Alex and Diana mentioned this quite nicely, and I should emphasize it. In Diana's work, she was saying there's a contract between the creators and the people sort of consuming the project, the audience. And there's nothing worse than having that contract broken in the middle of the movie. It pops you out of the movie if you've established some rules about, say, how your world works, which is a science issue. If you establish those rules early on and then you break them in the storytelling later on, people feel insulted. They don't engage. They don't go and see that project again. They don't tell their friends about it. So an advisor can help with that, regardless of what kind of subject matter it is. So obviously I am involved in things that have to do with physics primarily, and the kind of physics I do, which is to do with the nature of space and time and things like that. So of course, I can help if there's some question about very specific things about the science, but in the general, people create the rules and the rule book that they need, either for the entire universe or for that particular piece of the Marvel universe that they're doing in that film. And then the rules, so how does that thing look? How does that thing work? What happens when somebody points that thing and shoots it, or those sorts of things, and then help them be consistent with that. But I like to think that that's sort of often what I'm called in to do, but then I make a nuisance of myself and help them with other things as well, which I think are actually possibly more important. Things like showing the process of how science is done, which I think is much more important than sort of particular gee whiz facts about the science. Giving people a sense. We of course see how important it is right now in our real lives, when we're using science to protect us from this pandemic, for example. Knowing how the scientific process works should be part of people's basic literacy about science. And so I feel that something I can do is help sneak that into the things that we consume in entertainment, because it helps reinforce that understanding. And so it's a variety of things, not all of which I think are fully appreciated by the industry. And I've been sort of trying to make a bit of a nuisance of myself and help point out when those things are important. I should also mention a hugely important thing is also making people welcome in science. So really stop science being about particular images of a particular sort of, dude in a white lab coat kind of thing. Get away from that and realize that science is for everybody and everyone can be a scientist. And so if you show a variety of scientists on screen being involved in using science to do something, that can actually be incredibly powerful. So whenever I get opportunities, whether it be in Thor Ragnarok or for example in the Avengers movies, encouraging them to have it be not just Tony and Tony Stark and his other science bros using the science, but you see Shuri, you see others doing the science, showing that science and scientists are a diverse group as well.
Indeed,
so I hope that sort of helps.
Yes, and I think that's true. It's definitely true for science, and I think it's definitely as important in all aspects of life, seeing the diversity and inclusion of representation in all professions. Can you, people do when they're talking about working with a researcher, and particularly with scientists, that has a sort of perhaps unfair label, that collaboration puts a constraint on ideas, but actually really working with researchers tends to open up their ideas. Can you just sort of explain that a little bit?
That's a great question, and I think the role of the science advisor is evolving. There's no line item, right, in some line producer's Excel spreadsheet about the science advisor, because the role is sort of amorphous. No one knows what it means. The relationship changes depending upon which scientist you're working with, and so on and so forth. So again, what I try and do is keep pushing and broadening what's possible whenever I get involved in a project, and hope that some of that sticks for the next project. And the point there is that indeed we're not the science police. We're not there to go, well, you can't do that. You can't do that. No, you got that wrong. It doesn't look that way. They'd never say that. Those sorts of things. And often, I mean, there are science advisors who basically redline things like that. But I think that's not necessarily helpful, and you don't get called back. So what's much more helpful is to try and, of course, your primary role is to help the people tell their story as best as they can. And then if you get the opportunity, is you maybe find ways to help them tell it even better than they thought they could. So I'm first listening to the people. There's a lunch or something like that, and I'm just trying to hear what are the story goals, what do they really want to get across. And then it'll often be a situation where maybe there's a bit of science, maybe I'm called in. So for example, with Agent Carter, season 2, they called me in because they had a very specific question about a blob of goo that they wanted to know how it worked, and what it would do. Happily, they called me in very early, which is extremely important, I think, in this sort of relationship. And we just brainstormed. I sort of said, well, the blob of goo could be that, what have you, but what is it you want to do with it in the show? What is it going to do? And they hadn't written much yet. What actually came about from that was I helped them. I said, well, this blob of goo reminds me, because, I do sometimes read the comic, or used to, decades ago in some cases. So I was able to sort of go, what reminds me of this other thing, but also in the physics world, it reminds me of this thing. This is an exciting kind of material, an exotic kind of material that people are really playing with in the lab right now. So maybe it has these properties. That then helped them, first of all, come up with names for it. We brainstorm names based on the properties it might have, based on real physics. But then they wanted later in the story to know, how would the characters move this thing around? How would they control it? How would they stop it from doing certain things? Or how would it manifest if it interacted with the human body as superpowers? And then I was able to say, well, given that we've established these properties earlier in the conversation, we've really gone long beyond me just saying, this is what it is. We're playing together now and brainstorming. Given that we established these particular properties, it would be vulnerable to these other kinds of things. It would be able to be contained. So ultimately, I was able to actually design them machines that contained the thing. I think there's some visuals, some of the slides 4 and 5 and in the list. You can see that what I did is I sketched them ideas based again on real physics on how you would contain this thing. And then they actually built those machines. I mean, not literally. They built things that look like those machines for the purposes of the show. And there's a character who's got that stuff contained in his body, and he is actually living inside a human-sized version of that containment machine, so that he can actually, until they figure out what to do with it, he can sort of not have the thing infect his whole body, as it were. And so this is what I'm saying about the idea of brainstorming around an idea, not just coming in to give a grade on how well they did with the physics, allowed me then to give them back things that they could then use in later stories. So entire episodes came about from some of those chance remarks that developed into brainstorming ideas. And in fact, also entire characters. I later learned that the character you see there, who is a scientist, ended up being a scientist of color because they talked to me. I didn't tell them to do that. They actually just they realize, oh my goodness, scientists of color exist. And so you never know how these conversations can enhance the universe that they're building. And there were later episodes that were then based around the properties of this thing. There were later episodes that were based on the physics I gave them, equations I wrote them to put onto chalkboards, based again on some of those properties that I helped them develop. So that's a great example where your story world building starts with you being interested in maybe a particular question, but if you're open, and if your scientist is open to brainstorming and really collaborating in the creation process, it's no longer advisement, it's a collaboration, you can actually then end up with a much richer and sometimes surprisingly much more exciting universe, because sometimes I can bring in pieces of science that they hadn't heard of because it's brand new, which they then they end up being the first show to use this crazy new idea, and that can be fun, and the fans love that.
That's brilliant. And little do you know, they've actually created a portal to another dimension based on your work. I'm going to come on to Vivian. I mean, the work that many of you have been talking about, it starts off, it's been described as like working traditional film or television. A film is made, depending whether it's successful, and determines whether or not time and money is invested in creating a world for it. There are a few sort of exceptions to that, but that seems to be generally the model. Vivian, you've come at it like seemingly from a very different perspective. You've been uploading your animation for a good few years onto YouTube, but really it's with the launch of Has Been Hotel last year that's of particular relevance to this conversation. And it seemed that Has Been Hotel, and then shortly off the back of that, Hell of a Boss, like emerged as a world like fully created right from the get-go. Like when, like how did that world emerge? Like, because it does seem to be completely opposite approach to the more traditional avenue we might go down.
Well, yeah, I've had the project for a very long time, so part of it was just being able to stew in that universe and in that world for so long. It really just kind of, I had years to kind of trial and error what I wanted to do with the characters in the world, but it was really through the creation of the pilot of Has Been Hotel that I really got to really like sink into that world, because at the beginning of the story, I knew where the characters were, I knew who they were, and I knew the premise, but it was through really thinking hard about, because, for those who don't know, the premise of my project is that it's set in a fictional hell, or, fictional hell, it's set in like a very fictionalized, whimsical version of hell, my version of hell, and it's very, it's playing with so many different things because of that. So there's so many different texts to pull from. There's so many different religious things to research, and so many elements to creating a world that feels sort of like it's taking from the mythos of hell that already exists, while also allowing me to do my own spin on things. And so it was kind of just a mix of, I really like doing the research into things that fill out the world in like a more full way, because surprisingly, like there is a lot of like mythos and lore to hell from various texts and various, you know, ancient media and or ancient, you know, things to more pop culture-y things like Dante's Inferno and things like that. There's so many different things to pull from, and I wanted to kind of do my research on like all these different elements. And through the research, I found all these things that could lend itself to the story that I was telling specifically, you know, through the biblical texts of you know, we get into like Lucifer and what Lucifer means, and you know, the story of stories from the Bible that like are part of the narrative now of the project. So it was mostly just having the initial core characters, but then wanting to make sure that this world was figured out enough that the story that I want to tell with it would be reinforced by the world itself, and it would all make sense. And I think it comes from my kind of perspective of being somebody who, when I'm a fan of things, I like when the world is figured out enough that that you can really like, you can walk away from a movie or a show and you can kind of live in that world, and you can kind of imagine like, you know, what kinds of characters that you'd want to see from that world, or what kind of characters, you know, do you gravitate towards, and it feels like a world that could have multiple stories within it. And that's kind of what I've set out to create with my hell world in my stories, is that it's the biggest world I've created so far of all my projects, because I have a number of projects that take place in different worlds, but this is the biggest one, and it's the most realized one, because Has Been Hotel was my first project, but I have a completely different animated show called Hell of a Boss, but it's set in kind of the same spiritual, like, you know, universe as Has Been. So it's a unique challenge to kind of keep the shows entirely separate so that they can live and exist as their own projects, but kind of keep the universe intact throughout both. So it's a fun challenge for me, because I love the world building and I love like exploring it. And the fun thing that I found through it is that has a very specific set narrative, and it gets into it plays a lot with like biblical story and heaven and hell kind of thematics, and it has, you know, these two very big set pieces within its world, which is, you know, the hell and the heaven. But Hell of a Boss takes place entirely in hell, and it's based around characters who are the society of hell. So they are the species that have never lived before and gone to hell. They're like the creatures that live in this world. So it's a completely different thought process to think about how, you know, the stories that come from that world, because I'm like, no, this is the society of hell. So I had to basically create a whole nother level or layer of this, you know, hell universe, because I had to figure out how, you know, these species came about, how their you know, how their, you know, currency works, how their society works, how you know, these different players in this universe work, and how the hierarchy works, you know, because there's a, you know, there's a king, and then there's different levels of demons, and all of that's pulled from like kind of like the mythos of hell, like the goetic demons and the demon, like the 7 deadly sins and stuff like that. I've kind of created a society based on like these different classes of demons and how they interact with each other, and it's been a really fun like world to kind of figure out and like answer all these questions, because I've kind of asked myself a question and then figure out what the answer is, and it all lends itself back into the story, because when I go to write a script or to come up with an episode, I go, oh well, how would they, you know, like how would they go to the different rings of hell, like how is hell up, because there's 7 sins and there's different cities. So you know, I was like, well, let's split it up, like each ring is a different based on one of the different sins. But it's like, well, how do they travel through the sins, you know? So, you know, I thought about that, and I was like, well, you know, in the real world, we have things like airports, but obviously they don't fly to different countries. So what if it's just a giant elevator that's just kind of situated all around like the rings of hell, so they, you know, they can kind of go up and down. So it's like kind of figuring out all these like logistical things that can then help me tell my story. And like Diana said, like, I think it's really important for the audience, because like when you set up rules and then break them, people notice. And I think with me and my audience is that I really, really care about doing right by the audience, because the projects I make are still very independent and still very close to their audience. And especially something like Hasbin Hotel, you know, was very, it's very, it definitely resonated with an audience. And so I really feel a kinship with the audience to put in this work and put in this effort to make the universe make sense. And it's kind of how I approach all my stories from now on, is the more figured out the world is, the more informed the characters can be, and the more the audience can live in that world. And what's exciting is that I do see when you do make a world that feels real enough, you can see the audience start to like kind of insert themselves into this world and think about how they would interact, and they have a lot more fun. And it feels kind of like a video game or something like that. And the possibilities for stories seem endless, because you know, you can follow a different character and they'll have a completely different experience if the world is rich enough to explore.
I mean, I'd love to hear more about sort of like working on YouTube, where you've got a more direct relationship with that audience, the role that audience has in shaping both the world and the stories you might want to tell from that world. But just touching, going back very briefly to sort of the approach you took. I mean, Hell of a Boss came off the back of Hasbin Hotel so soon off the back. It was clear that there was a world there that you were working with. And just the economics is just quite interesting, in the sense that, let's say, like the traditional approach mindset might be, well, we'll see like how a film goes, and then we'll decide whether to invest the resource into creating the world that might then tell other stories. Whereas I get a sense, like, having created that world in your head, like if Hasbin Hotel hadn't been a success, like you would have launched a Hell of a Boss, and then there probably would be another story that you would do off the back of it. And it's sort of like there's such a wealth of stories that the economics for you is like, makes sense just to create the most incredible world and then exploit it as in as rich and diverse way as you possibly can.
Yeah, I think for me it's just, yeah, it's having that playground to really like go like just really deep into, because I think the more figured out the playground, the world is, the more the stories can kind of come through that. And I usually actually start with characters. So I start with characters that I really want to spend time with. And then I figure out what their world would be, what world serves their story. So with Hasbin, you know, I did have these characters first, but I developed the world second, before even the story, because the world is so integral to the story of Hasbin. And through creating the world of Hasbin, I discovered other avenues. So Hell of a Boss, for example, came about because I was developing the kinds of characters that would be really interesting for the characters in Hasbin to interact with. And you know, I came up with these original citizens of this hell universe, rather than people who died and, you know, went to hell, which is how, you know, most of the characters in the story operate. So I kind of had to figure out how that works, while on top of, you know, these creatures that were existing in this fictional universe. And I thought that was a really interesting angle. I thought that was a different angle from the story that I was telling with Hasbin Hotel, and it felt like a completely different chapter and a completely different entity. So that's how it kind of sprouted off from the Hasbin like element, because it had nothing to do with the Hasbin story that I was developing, but it was still part of this world. But it was a completely, I consider the shows very, they're very mirrors of each other, because one explores one very key important part of the world, and then the other one shows and explores everything that we don't see in Hasbin Hotel is in Hell of a Boss. So they feel very like mirrored with each other, and they feel very it gave me the chance to figure out all the things that I didn't figure out when I was developing Has Been. And so now that they're both figured out together, I feel like going into continuing the stories of both projects, each one will be just that much more informed, and the audience will have that much more meat to kind of dive into, and they'll have that much more interesting things to fill out when they want to engage with the story. So, you know, if they want to create characters that live in this world, or if they want to create theories about where it's going, or you know, wondering how, you know, various different you know, creatures and mythos would exist in this world, like they have enough information about how this world works to go off and have their own fun with it. And that's really what I want to do as a creator, is create worlds that give that escapism, because I do believe very, very strongly in escapism of media, you know, escapism into stories and into worlds, because, you know, the real world can be very hard. So it's a good way to you know, really get away from that. But I think that's why it's important to have the world as figured out as possible, because, you know, as soon as you start breaking rules, it starts to feel a little cheapened, and I feel like people start to lose that escapism because it kind of takes them out of it. So that's kind of my approach. That's why I start with the world as much as the characters before getting into like the meat of the story, because I do think it's a really key part.
Thanks, Vivian. And we're coming towards the end of the session, but I want to open it out slightly to the whole panel. But if there are any questions from those watching, but Vivian, just to go back to sort of that relationship you have, the more direct relationship you have with your audience. We've talked before this evening about how creating these worlds creates sort of these vast opportunities, and so many opportunities. Like, where do you focus your attention? And I'm sort of interested in, like, for all the people, sort of like what's your approach to deciding where to focus your attention? But Vivian, in particular, like, what, if any, role does your audience like have in helping you decide that?
Oh man, it's tough. I definitely because it's hard, especially with someone like I do, where I actually have ADD, so I will want to jump around to things all the time, and it's, you know, it's a blessing and a curse. I see it as from a creative standpoint, because, you know, I'll get very impatient with projects and want to jump and start and develop like all kinds of new things. So, you know, on one hand, I'm creating a lot of unique different things, but on the other hand, there's only so many that reasonably you can do in a life. So for me, when it comes to deciding which of these projects and worlds to develop and get into, it's mostly just about what sorts of worlds I feel are something different, and something that are unique to me and my voice, or something that I feel like would be a good world to escape into, whether it be, you know, with the Has Been universe, it's a very expansive, it's my version of hell. So it's like a very expansive, hellish universe. It's full of demons, it's full of monsters, and it's playing with you know, tropes from various ancient sources and everything like that. But you know, when it comes to developing new ones, I usually gauge what the audience is enjoying. You know, if the audience isn't enjoying a story that I'm working on, then my attitude is to move on to try to do something that maybe will resonate a little bit more. Because I feel like there's so many stories within me that it would be a little bit silly to mess around in a world if, you know, it was only resonating with me. But so far, I mean, I've been thankful that the Has Been and Hell of a universe has been so enjoyable for people. But I have, you know, like, I have a desire to tell a few more kinds of worlds. Like there's worlds that I'm developing that are more like the fantasy aspect, like fantasy in nature, and like my version of like a world where like dinosaurs didn't go extinct and things like that. It's like that's a completely different world to kind of figure out, and a completely different mindset kind of for storytelling, because it's less of a society and more of like, you know, kind of looking into like, you know, what kind of world would, you know, like what kind of continents would there be if like there was no asteroid, or like, you know, if Pangea didn't change, or like all that sort of thing like that. Like there's so many other kinds of worlds that lend themselves to other genres that I think are fun to explore. But ultimately, I trust the audience to kind of dictate a little bit of like what they think is a fun world to explore within my project. So I try to do as many little one-off things as I can to kind of like just get them out. But also if something resonates, like I kind of keep note of that and make sure that I'll find a way to bring that back to the audience in some way in the future.
Brilliant. And Alex, Diana, do you have anything to add to sort of like to Vivian in terms of like the work that you're doing, deciding like where you focus your attention in those vast worlds you're creating?
Diana, do you want to go first? Yeah.
I was going to say that I guess what I'm trying to do when I'm working with an audience is like, I really want people to be intrigued and curious about the world that I'm creating. And so I'm looking for those signs. I don't want to fill in every single gap, because if we don't allow an audience to be able to imagine a little bit more, we can also lose them if we tell them everything. So I don't want to be explaining. I don't think everyone has to know how that character got that gun or got their name. I would like to have them be able to fill in some blanks. And then then you start to feel like, oh, the audience really wants to know this, then you can tell that story. But I think on the whole, I just want people intrigued, not confused, engaged, and not preached to. And that's the balance that I'm trying to work on in all the stories that I do.
Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of curiosity. I think it's central. I mean, we don't often have access to our audience. You know, it's often by default they're coming later. So we're stand-ins for that. And I think the reason you gather a lot of people into a world build is you're asking those questions. And we're doing a quadruple A multiplayer game right now, and you know you've got an audience of 1 million who have spent 2 years in that world. You've got to really go deep, or you've got the logic has to just permeate everything. And so in that space, my team and I are you know, flying through the world. We're testing it all of the time. And as we test it and it breaks, then you fill in. But I totally agree with Diana. You do not give them a finished world because they're participant in that. And I think there's a version of high resolution and low resolution, you know, skinning the ideas that are substantial and foundational in the sense of the rules and the logic, but it's got to stand up to, you know, massive audiences, whether it's an immersive experience of an audience in a 2D film space, or interactive, or fully immersive, VR, whatever it is. You have to understand the medium, but you have to be that curious person in that space, and you've got to try and break it. Honestly, you're constantly trying to challenge yourself and mess it up. You know, that's test number one, that you're the audience who are going to be more critical than anybody.
I just think we've got a question from Neil asking, so it's to Vivian and to everybody else. What methods do you use to design the world, and then how do you make that available to your collaborators? Do you use like scripts, illustration, short content? Like what are the methods you actually use practically?
I mean, for me, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I think there's a delay on mine, so I do apologize for that. Okay, I'll make mine quick. I literally just start with design. So mine's a simple answer. I start with the visual design.
Yeah, I agree.
Alex, it's all in the visuals.
Yeah,
Alex.
I mean, I think it's world first, and a world is 4-dimensional, and it has to be designed. A linear narrative can't really drive the world at the scale we're talking about. It's a collaboration, but it's absolutely a design. But a narrative design is the way I would describe it. but it's a new, it's a new form really, and it has to change. Production has to change. As Clifford was saying, there's not a line item very often for this, and yet potentially the budget is going to be cut, dramatically because you've investigated the world in the full sense. But you have a whole slew of tools available to you, and that is research and illustration, and a lot to do with game engine and wireframe and VR, and you're putting the director inside the world and using all of those tools and balancing them because you're testing it constantly, and it's a four-dimensional space, and we're only just now having the tools that we really need to do that.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and if the questions
go on, Diana.
Just quick, if the question is a practical one about what actual tools to use, I take my cues from doing video games. So I create a game design doc. That's Excel. There's also Airtable. You have to figure out a database so everybody can join in, and so the information doesn't get lost. And so, unfortunately, there's no perfect tool right now on the marketplace. I'm hoping all these databases figure themselves out. But just you just have to figure out what paper, Google Docs, Dropbox, whatever to use. But it's got to be really cohesive. Good luck, because it's hard.
Brilliant. Thank you. And we're out of time. That I said we could keep talking for many hours. So it's amazing that we managed to to the length we have. But I'm just going to wrap by saying a very big thank you to all of our speakers, to Vivian, to Diana, to Clifford, and to Alex. And thank you very much. It's been illuminating, and it'll be fascinating to see how all of this work evolves over, and how many more worlds and stories Vivian creates in the world of hell. And then I'm going to hand back over to Alex.